What if I told you that in the 19th century, women were subjected to searches so degrading they left scars far deeper than prison walls? Why did a society that preached purity and morality create rituals designed to strip women of dignity in the most humiliating ways? And how could these hidden practices remain buried in history, almost forgotten, while shaping the way women were treated for generations? This is not just a story about punishment, it is a story about power, shame, and survival. Stay with me until the end, because every detail you're about to hear will change the way you think about the past. When we picture the 19th century, many of us imagine elegance, grand ballrooms, stiff corsets, and portraits of women with gentle smiles. But behind those painted images was a much darker truth. For countless women, the walls of prisons and reform institutions became places where their bodies were no longer their own. In that era, being accused of even a minor offense could mean losing every shred of dignity. A young woman suspected of theft or labeled as immoral was often dragged into cells where she faced examinations that were less about justice and more about control. These were not medical checks meant to protect her health. They were rituals of power, where every glance, every hand, carried the message: you are no longer a person, you are property of the system. I sometimes think about what it must have felt like to walk into those cold, echoing halls. Imagine the sound of boots on stone floors, the clanging of keys, and the moment when a woman realized she was about to be searched in ways she could never have imagined. No privacy, no choice, only humiliation. And what breaks my heart is that many of these women were not hardened criminals at all. Some were simply poor, some had no family to protect them, some had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. What makes this even more striking is the hypocrisy of the society outside. On the surface, Victorian culture preached morality and purity. Women were told to be delicate, modest, almost angelic. Yet, behind prison doors, the very same society sanctioned acts that stripped those same women of every trace of modesty. It was a brutal contradiction, and it reveals how power often hides behind masks of morality. I cannot help but wonder, if I had lived in that time, how would I have endured such treatment? Would I have been able to stand tall? Or would the shame have broken me? It is questions like these that remind us these women were not faceless victims in old books. They were human beings with fear, courage, and silent cries that history almost silenced. And this is only the beginning. Because once you understand how easily dignity was taken, you can start to see how the very act of searching became more than just a routine. It became a ritual of domination. And in the next part, we will look at those rituals more closely, at how stripping dignity became a weapon in itself. If part 1 was about the fear of losing control, part 2 is about what happened when that fear became reality. For many women in 19th century prisons, the so-called search was less about finding contraband and more about reminding them that they had no power left. It was a ritual of humiliation, repeated over and over until it broke something inside. Imagine this: a woman brought into a stark, dimly lit room, told to undress in front of strangers. Her clothes, the very thing that offered her modesty, were taken away piece by piece. Every item stripped was a reminder that she was no longer protected by privacy, by dignity, or even by society's rules of decency. For some, the worst part was not the physical act itself, but the way it was performed: cold, methodical, without a shred of compassion. I think about how we sometimes underestimate the power of rituals. A ritual is not always a religious ceremony. It can also be something repeated with the intent to send a message. In this case, the message was cruelly clear: we control you, body and soul. And what makes this even more unsettling is that these practices were justified as necessary, as though shaming women was somehow part of maintaining order. When I close my eyes, I can almost hear the echo of heavy doors slamming shut, the shuffle of women forced into lines, and the sharp command of guards. To the outside world, this might have looked like discipline, but to those women, it was nothing short of degradation. What strikes me most is how silence surrounded these moments. Few dared to speak, and even fewer were believed if they tried. Their suffering was hidden behind stone walls, disguised under the language of law and morality. Personally, I cannot help but feel a deep ache when I think of this. Because humiliation is not something that fades quickly, it lingers. It scars. And for many of those women, The memory of being stripped bare under the cold gaze of authority haunted them long after they left those walls. It was not just a violation of the body, it was a theft of identity. A way of erasing who they were and replacing it with who the system wanted them to be. And yet, as cruel as this ritual of control was, it did not end there. The humiliation did not stay locked behind prison doors. It seeped outward, shaping how these women were seen by society, how they were judged, and how their silence became part of a much larger story. And that is where we need to go next, beyond the walls. Into the social stigma and the silent suffering that followed them wherever they went. If the search itself was a wound, the world outside was salt poured onto it. For women in the 19th century, the punishment rarely ended inside the prison. Once labeled, they carried that mark like a shadow that never left. Imagine a young woman, finally released after months behind bars. She steps onto the street, breathing freedom, yet every glance reminds her that society does not forgive easily. Neighbors whisper, families distance themselves, even potential employers turn their eyes away. In a culture obsessed with purity, once a woman's dignity was questioned, even falsely, she was branded forever. What moves me most is how silence became their only companion. Who could they tell? Who would believe them if they spoke of the humiliations they endured? Many women chose silence not because they lacked the courage to speak, but because they knew their voices would be twisted against them. And in that silence, they carried invisible chains, shame, fear, and the sense that their suffering could never be shared. Sometimes I wonder about the strength it must have taken to walk into a market, to hear the snide remarks, to feel the weight of judgment on every step, and still hold your head high. I know that if I had been in their place, I might have crumbled under that constant scrutiny. Because humiliation within walls is one thing, but humiliation echoed by society is another. It is endless. What makes this even more heartbreaking is the hypocrisy. Men with criminal pasts could sometimes rebuild their lives, even regain respect. But women? One stain on their reputation was enough to define them for life. The very system that claimed to reform them instead ensured they remained outcasts. And yet, in this suffocating silence, some women found ways to endure. They found fragments of resilience, small acts of defiance, quiet strength that history rarely records. And that brings us to something remarkable: how, even in the face of humiliation and stigma, some women chose to resist, to survive, and to leave behind whispers of their untold stories. Even in the darkest places, there is always a spark of resistance. For the women who endured these humiliations in the 19th century, survival itself was an act of quiet rebellion. They were expected to remain broken, silent, and ashamed, but some refused to let the system have the last word. I imagine a young woman, sitting alone in her cell after a degrading search, whispering her story into a scrap of cloth, a hidden diary, or even to the memory of another prisoner. Those whispers, though fragile, carried strength. They reminded her, and perhaps others, that dignity could still live in silence. And in rare cases, these voices managed to reach the outside world, tucked away in letters, journals, or testimonies that historians would uncover much later. What strikes me is how resistance did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as holding on to hope, refusing to accept the label that society forced upon them. Other times, it was helping a fellow prisoner endure one more day, sharing food, or offering comfort in a place designed to erase compassion. These small acts might seem invisible to history, but they were lifelines. Personally, I find these fragments of resilience deeply moving, because if I had lived in that time, I don't know if I would have had the courage to resist. To face humiliation day after day and still cling to the belief that my voice mattered, it feels almost unimaginable. And yet, they did. That is why their stories, though scattered and faint, matter so much. The tragedy, of course, is that many of these voices never reached us. Countless women lived and died without their stories being told. But the few that do remain challenge us today. They remind us that history is not only about laws, rulers, or wars, it is about human endurance, the will to survive, and the refusal to let oppression define a life completely. And as we step into the final part, I want to leave you with this thought. These stories of resistance are not just about the past. They ask us a question that is very much about the present. What do we learn when we hear them? And how do we choose to carry their legacy forward? As we look back at these forgotten stories, I think the hardest truth is that humiliation was not just a punishment, it was a tool of power. It tells us something about how far institutions will go when they believe they own not only a person's body, but also their dignity. And although we are speaking about the 19th century, the echoes of this still ripple into the present. Today, we live in a world that often tells us we are more free, more equal, more protected, and in many ways, that is true. But if we are honest, questions remain. Who still bears the weight of judgment when they step out of line? Who still feels society's whispers, even after they have paid their debt, or done nothing wrong at all? The stories of these women ask us to look closer, not just at history, but at ourselves. What moves me most is that these women, despite being silenced, still speak to us, not through grand monuments or famous books, but through the fragments of memory that survived. And when I hear them, I feel as though they are asking us not to look away. They are asking us to remember that dignity is fragile, and that once taken, it cannot be easily restored. Personally, I carry a deep respect for their resilience. If they could endure humiliation, stigma, and silence, and still hold on to their humanity, then perhaps we can learn to do better in our own time. We can learn to treat every person, even those society may judge as fully human, deserving of dignity and compassion. So when we remember the 19th century, let us not only picture the ballrooms, the corsets, or the polished portraits, let us also remember the hidden rooms, the heavy doors, and the women who walked through them with silent courage. Because their stories are not just about the past, they are a mirror, asking us what kind of society we choose to be today. And that is why their voices, though once silenced, must continue to be heard.